Welcome everyone to the Governance Roundtable of the Ostrom Workshop, or GROW, where we work together to better understand and manage common challenges facing our communities and the world. I'm Bill Blomquist, a Senior Research Fellow in the Ostrom Workshop. This podcast series is designed to highlight work being done by scholars affiliated with or visiting the Ostrom Workshop at Indiana University. The Ostrom Workshop is named for Eleanor Ostrom, who won the Nobel Prize in Economics in 2009, and her husband and colleague Vincent Ostrom, who together helped demonstrate the importance of building trust and community to sustainably manage shared resources and democratic republics. That work challenged conventional wisdom of the time and helped usher in a new wave of research grounded, among other things, in empirically verifiable fieldwork. Today, I'm speaking with Professor Sheila Foster. Professor Foster is the Scott Ginsberg Professor of Urban Law and Policy at Georgetown University, with joint appointments on the faculties of the Georgetown Law School and Georgetown's McCourt School of Public Policy. She received her JD from the University of California, Berkeley. And Professor Foster is the author of many law review articles and book chapters, is co-author of the books Comparative Equality and Anti-Discrimination Law, and From the Ground Up, Environmental Racism and the Rise of the Environmental Justice Movement, plus a brand new book, Co-Cities. She's also co-editor of a forthcoming Cambridge Handbook of Commons Research Innovations. Welcome to the Governance Roundtable, Professor Foster.
Thank you. It's great to be here. Thanks for having me.
And we're going to start off. I'm just going to ask you, Sheila, about your current research. Tell us what you're working on these days.
Sure. So I am working on two Commons-related books. One is the MIT Press book that you've mentioned that is a culmination of a lot of years of both normative work by myself and my co-author Christian Ione on the urban commons, thinking through what kinds of resources are and can be called commons, as well as a huge empirical Co-Cities project where we surveyed projects and policies in over 180 cities to try to extract some principles from those about the urban commons. And so that's one book. That's a book that we're finishing up for MIT Press. And the other book is the Cambridge book that you mentioned, which arose out of a conference that I put on at Georgetown with the International Association for the Study of the Commons to mark, ostensibly, though it was more about Ostrom, but to mark the 50th anniversary of the tragedy of the Commons. Essay by Garrett Hardin, although the conference was really all about how we've moved beyond that framework, not just Ostrom, but even further around commons innovation. And some of the other things I'm working on are just thinking through what we might call place-based governance, both as a legal matter and also as a policy matter. And that can include commons as well as other kinds of governance, private communities, and other innovations in how people arrange collectively to govern the places that they're in, and sometimes that can be private and not actually a common good. So there's been a lot of literature around that over the years, in particular legal literature. So I've been starting to walk down that road, and in particular within that, I'm interested in the question of what do we think of as public and private property and goods in cities. I think we have a really robust idea of what private property is, and a really robust idea about common property and the different kind, or commons, rather, common pool resources, but not so much of a robust idea about what should be public property and the variations of that. So I'll stop there. So those are the kind of issues I'm working on.
Yeah, and it's very interesting, and I wanted to ask you a question that I think is probably related to that, which is you have had several visiting scholar appointments at other universities, particularly in Europe, and I just wondered how this has fed your interest in place-based governance, how this has fed your interest in the different ways we think about private and public, that comparative perspective that you've gained?
Mhm. That's a really good question. And actually, it wasn't the European visits that did it. It was more uh, a research journey that I was on about maybe, well, I'm not going to date myself, a long time ago, with a number of legal scholars where we traveled around Latin America, actually, to various Latin American cities to look at the intersection between urban development and environmental issues. And these were mostly environmental legal scholars, but also some scholars that were looking at urban issues within a legal framework. And, you know, this included going to Bogota, going to Panama, Havana, Cuba, etc. And the way that shaped my understanding, or my research rather, and my understanding of these issues and my broadening of these issues, because for a long time I was writing in the area of environmental justice, was spending time actually in Bogota, which was interesting for two reasons. One, the mayor at the time, a famous urban planner, had done some really incredible things with the city. But one of the things he was trying to do, and they were trying to do, is figure out how to incorporate the informal settlements. And when we visited the informal settlements, these informal communities around Bogota, I remember a light bulb going off and thinking that, wow, you know, not only is this a place that is self-made and self-governed by this incredibly complex and large community, but it also raises a lot of the questions around the commons, right? Around common resources. You know, they've taken land that was kind of available. They've either squatted or they otherwise just built on top of it, even if so. Squatting implies that someone else owned it, but that's not always the case. But they've taken available land, they've created these communities. And so immediately it made me think about everything I learned about around environmental law. And thinking beyond, I think the way I was thinking about environmental issues as attention. When we think about environmental issues, we think about natural resources. We don't think about kind of urban goods or places where people live as communities. Of course, we think about clean air and clean water in those communities, but we don't think about communities. Right. And so I was always trying to fit these two together in environmental justice. Like environmental justice focuses on, or the justice part, on populations, and it's people-based. Environmental law is very much focused on resources, air, water, et cetera. But the commons brings together both in an interesting way. And so it was really that trip to Latin America that made me think of outside of the box, and also with scholars, Latin American scholars. When I came back from that trip, I put on a comparative conference on the social function of property doctrine. Most Latin American constitutions, some European also, have this idea in their constitutions that property should be put to its social function. Of course, that, you know, what a social function is varies in terms of the jurisprudence of these companies, countries. But this idea that, you know, this dual idea to think about these communities in the way that Ostrom did, right? But outside of natural resources, but as kind of using the infrastructure, including land, of the urban environment to pool and create and then govern as communities. Like, what does that add to the way we think about urban planning and regulating cities? But also the idea of rethinking property beyond public, private, or at least even private property, some internal limits. And that's what the social function of property does, in a way that in American law, we don't have those kind of strong internal limits to property rights. A owner that has all of the entitlements aggregated, you know, gets to keep those and enforce those quite aggressively in American law, even if they're not putting property to productive use, even if it sits empty.
And I want to pick up from one of the things that you said about, and it certainly has struck me as well, that there's a difference between thinking about these sort of public management situations by looking at the people versus looking at the resource. And a fair amount of environmental law and policy literature sort of starts from the resource and then, what should people do? And that your own curiosity came at this from a different direction, which is, well, here are a group of people, what are they doing to deal with their, shared and overlapping situations, which I think is probably sort of a way of understanding some of Eleanor Ostrom's work. Can you draw the connection? You've already drawn it a couple of times between your work and the work of the Ostroms, but are there ways in which your own thinking and your own research over time on governance has either been influenced by or maybe even led to a critique of some of the work of either Eleanor or Vincent or both?
So certainly I always think of myself as walking in Lynn Ostrom's footsteps in terms of at least methodologically, right? In terms of, really, and I've always done this, even in my environmental justice work, going to the ground, going to putting a microscopic focus on that level of action, communities versus just the policies, for instance, which a lot of law professors start from, right? You look at what the law is, what the legislation is, what the framework is, and then you go from there. So I've always done it just the opposite, knowing that there's, of course, an important backdrop, a legal backdrop or guardrails on how much you can theorize from the ground up in that sense. But certainly, so when I was in Latin America, the choices they had were, should we regularize these communities or should we give them private property rights, titles, in the way that Hernando de Soto argued when he was at the World Bank. And so my immediate thought was Ostrom was to say, but there's a third option, which is to say that, and we see it in effect here. And one of the things that Ostrom found, and not just Ostrom, of course, other people, about the endogeneity of these communities, the fact that close-knit communities can come up with rules of governance, can, manage themselves, can use and govern resources sustainably in a way that they were doing, it struck me, in these communities, but at a much larger scale, right, than many of Ostrom's, right, examples. And so that's what, so that, and also the Ostroms work on polycentric governance and their work in metropolitan areas, right? Some of the older political science work around whether having more fragmentation, let's say in services or even government, is more efficient, right, than not, when people get to choose, right, their services, and you have more of that rather than less. So all of that influenced the way I think about, right, or I began to think about these communities and what was going on, and even the choice that the local government had, right, in terms of how to govern land that was clearly a part of, if not legally, certainly politically and economically, a part of its local government or its landscape.
Yeah, exactly. And in any kinds of communities, whether they're in densely urban settings or on the urban periphery, you've studied a lot of them in a lot of places and developed pretty extensive sets of data and cases. One of the things that, as you know, Eleanor came around to later in her career was the significance of trust and social capital. And whether it's people almost creating a community from scratch on a hillside overlooking a metropolitan area, or people embedded in maybe a European capital that goes back centuries. What do you see as the role that trust plays and trust building or trust erosion in governance?
So that's a really great question, and I subscribe to everything she came, I think, to hold as important and salient about trust in social capital, and I've seen it. So I first started looking at this issue back in 2005-06. One of my first articles was about the controversy over community gardens in New York City, and when Mayor Giuliani came into office, to bring New York City back, one of the things he proposed was to destroy the community gardens in New York, and they were built on vacant lots, of course, and the city had given short-term leases to these gardeners, and there was a lawsuit brought to stop him from doing that, and of course they lost because there was no property entitlement. But one of the things I talked about was the way in which, in thinking through these land use, these legal questions, we don't consider the kinds of harms that are important to these resources, such as the loss of social capital. Like one of the empirical observations from academics who studied these gardens and what they meant to these communities, was that they both captured the level of trust within the communities because in order to construct this commons, you had to be able to work with others to do that. So that certainly what Robert Putnam called the bonding social capital was important, both as a precondition, but also as as one of the benefits of having them is that it strengthened those. But also interestingly, and maybe this goes beyond Ostrom's findings, is that in particular in cities, in particular when we're talking about economic and racial disparities, the gardens were also important for what Putnam talked about was bridging social capital, that it really brought people into these communities that were gardening with them that were of different economic and ethnic backgrounds, and that was really important in terms of if you thought about the larger city, as we came to think about as a kind of commons. And we use that term loosely, but in the sense that, it is a collectively governed in some sense resource, and many of the shared resources within them, right, have some various forms of collaborative governance. And so if you think about, thick urban environments, right, in which you have very diverse communities and you have a lot of diversity and even a lot of social tension, that these kinds of commons, urban commons, both depend upon, but importantly foster the kinds of social capital that Ostrom talks about, but even going further, this bridging capital, which is important for economic mobility and social, I think, functioning in a thick urban environment.
Right, and it's one of the things, I suppose, that makes studying commons or commoning or whatever phrases we use for it in the urban environment so different and so challenging. You're not, I mean, there's segregation, there's isolation in urban centers, but on the whole, it's just by nature a more heterogeneous setting than the sort of smaller scale village commons that that earlier common pool resource studies focused on. So I guess that's just a way of inviting you to say a couple minutes more about why it's so important that we think about the commons in the context of urban places.
Sure, right. I do think it's different. So, in the MIT book, we kind of make this pivot away from Ostrom and say, like we're walking in the footsteps of Ostrom, and so much of what Ostrom says is applicable to urban environments, but so much is not. In part because the kind of social environment is different, but also the resource question is different. So if you think about the commons as both, the resource itself, the common pool resource itself, but also the collective action, right, between social actors. Both of those things are quite different. I mean, of course, there are natural resources in cities, lakes, et cetera, that in Ostrom and Nagendra studied that, as have other people. And but so much of the urban environment or commons, we would argue, are constructed commons, right? They don't just exist. They're constructed out of what one might think of as a common pool resource, which is the infrastructure of the city, right? But also collective action happens so it happens in sometimes very thick and large scale cities on the one hand, so that's different. On the other hand, though, if you look at the scale of the resource itself, if you're talking about a community garden, or if you're talking about, cooperative housing or other kinds of, or park groups, for instance, that are managing a park. I mean, sometimes those communities are quite homogeneous in the sense that, or homogeneous rather, in the sense that they're, because of the racial segregation and the economic stratification and even the ethnic stratification in many cities, that, it's not uncommon to common in an environment that looks a lot like Ostrom's small villages. And I think that's particularly so when you talk about big cities like New York City, for instance, and other places that are pretty heterogeneous if you look at the city at scale of the city. But if you look neighborhood to neighborhood, New York City is one of the most racially segregated cities in the country, which people always seem to be surprised about, but you can only be surprised about if you spend time in Manhattan and even Manhattan south of 96th Street. Once you get outside those areas, then you would not be surprised about that. So it's not an either or, it's a both and. It's both that Ostrom is applicable, right? And a lot of the examples do map on the collective action front, right? I think this word that you can construct urban commons easier on some level if you have communities that are homogeneous, that have that social capital, and that can mimic itself right in the urban environment at the neighborhood level. On the other hand, particularly when it comes to the resource itself and what you're constructing, then I think you start to hit a lot of the limits, even in homogeneous communities, of just transposing Ostrom onto the urban environment. Because number one, this is not happening in what I've called a pre-political environment, right? Cities are heavily regulated, heavily privatized. The common pool resources from which you're trying to construct new goods are often locked up in some form, right? They're either heavily regulated or owned, and sometimes their ownership is in transition from private to public, if you're talking about vacant and available land and buildings. So there, I think you really hit the limits, and you have to think outside of the Ostrom framework. And that's where I think a lot of the contribution of my work and my co-author's work does a lot of theorizing and conceptualizing.
That is a terrific note for us to wrap this conversation on, because the work of understanding governance goes on, and we keep finding additional frontiers in which to pursue it. Sheila Foster, thanks so much for being with us. And to our listeners, that's it for this episode of the Governance Roundtable. A reminder that the views expressed are those of the participants and not necessarily those of Indiana University. For more information on the Ostrom Workshop, check out Ostrom Workshop, all one word, .indiana.edu. Most of our events are open to the public and also available via Zoom. So until next time, we hope you come and grow with us again soon. And again, Sheila Foster, thank you so much.
You're quite welcome. Thank you.